Good morning, everybody. It is Sunday, January the 23rd of 2022. This will be our virtual Sunday school lesson for this week. Thank y'all for joining us this morning. I want to open us up in a word of prayer, and we'll go and jump into the lesson and get started and see what the Lord's prepared for us this morning. So I'll do that now. Dear Lord, we come to you this morning. We just thank you for loving us, Lord. Thank you for giving us your word so we can study it. Thank you for just always meeting our needs and providing for us, Lord. And we just pray that you be with us now this morning, Lord, as we go through this lesson. Pray that you open our hearts, open our minds, and just let us absorb everything that you've laid out there for us, Lord. And we just thank you for all your many blessings. In Jesus' holy name we pray. Amen. All right, so last week we continue talking about prayer as we have been, and we've been looking at some of the we've been looking at the children of Israel and looking at how God answered their prayers, and not only their prayers, mainly a lot of Moses' prayers were answered during this time, and that's what we'll see again today. Is Moses and Aaron, they pray again to God, and we'll see God answer their prayer. And but we've been looking kind of how God answers prayer and how we should respond, and we're looking at examples in the Bible. We've just looked at we've been talking about the children of Israel, and their period of wandering in the wilderness is kind of where we're at with them. We're in their journey, and we looked at Korah's rebellion a few weeks ago and all aspects of that, and then we saw the children of Israel still murmur against God, and even after Korah rebelled, God opened the ground up, swallowed up all those that appertained to him, and then the 250 other men who were challenging Aaron at the tabernacle, God struck them dead with fire from heaven. And then, if you remember, they took all the censers, the brass censers that they had made, and they melted them down or beat them down. However they did it, they made them into plates and made a covering for the bronze altar out in the courtyard of the tabernacle. And they did that to be a reminder to anybody else who tried to challenge Moses and Aaron and God. And what we saw was just one day after that, the nation of Israel murmured again and tried to say that Moses and Aaron were still the ones who were doing all these things, and they were trying to get they were trying to do what they wanted to do. They weren't following God. God didn't send them, is basically what the people were saying. But we saw then that God sent a plague and plagued the Israelites, and Moses and Aaron had to pray for them again and burn incense. And remember, Aaron had to come from the tabernacle and run down with the incense between the sick people and the healthy people, and God stopped the plague. So right after that, and that's the reason I went into those great details, because last week, chapter 17, we were in the book of Numbers, chapter 17, and what we saw there was God, he set up another token, another reminder that to help the children of Israel to be there so that they would remember the things that happened and that God had called them. So God tells Moses to have each tribe bring a rod to the tabernacle, and for them to write their names on it, whether they did it with some kind of ink or if they carved their names in it, I don't really know. But either way, they brought their stick, they put their name on it, so they knew that they had wrote it. It was in their handwriting, and so they'd be able to identify it after the fact. So that's what they did. They brought them there. God told them to put the 12 rods in the tabernacle, and he was going to make one of them blossom. And the one that blossomed was who he had appointed as his priest, or the family he wanted to be over the priest and be the priest. And we saw that Moses took 12 or the 13 rods, because there was 12 tribes, and then Aaron of course brought a rod for the tribe of Levi, and they put them in the tabernacle, and they waited overnight. The next day they went in, and of course Moses saw that Aaron's rod had not only blossomed, but it budded and yielded almonds, all overnight. So see another great miracle that the Lord did, and you kind of ask, well, why did God do this? Well, He told us why He did it. He did it so that this would be something else that would, more evidence. It would be something they could use to, so that if anybody tried to challenge Moses and Aaron in the future, it'd be another reminder to them that God has, given them plenty of evidence who He had called, who He wanted leading the nation, and who was supposed to do that. And of course, we know it's the tribe of Levi, and that's what they saw. And they told him to. They didn't get rid of the rod either. They were supposed to put it in the tabernacle, so it would be there, and it would be a continual reminder to take away any of the future murmurings that might arise. Just try to get rid of them before they start. And of course, we saw the Israelites. They committed to do these things. They said, okay, we understand if we challenge the priesthood again and we try to do the office of a priest, then the consequence of that is death. And and we saw that with Korah, and then even with Aaron's sons. If you remember, I can't remember their name. I know he had 4 sons, but 2 of them offered strange incense, and they didn't do the office. They didn't take their responsibility seriously and didn't do it the exact way God told them to. So even they died because of what they did. So the office of the priesthood was very important, very significant, and they had a very important role. So anyway, so he set those tokens up. We looked at a couple of other things where God had told him, and there's plenty more in the Bible. We looked at 2 because we had covered those, and they kind of tied into our story. We looked back at Exodus chapter 12 and saw, they had the first Passover. Well, during the first Passover, God had told them to, I want you to have this feast annually, have an annual celebration so that you will remember that I spared y'all during the 10th plague on the land of Egypt. So during the 10th plague, all the firstborn died, but God said, for this plague to not to affect you, you got to kill the Passover lamb. You got to eat. Each house has to kill their own lamb. You eat it. You burn the leftovers. You take the blood, put it on your doorpost and on your lintel, and the death angel will pass over your house. So that's what they did, and God wanted them to celebrate this annually, so to remind them, so they didn't forget the great things that God had done for them. We also looked in in Exodus chapter 13. We saw that, remember, one of the requirements that God put on it, He said, since I spared you, then every firstborn animal, every firstborn child you have, you either have to set it apart to the Lord, or you have to redeem it with another animal. So, and there were certain animals they had to sacrifice, certain animals they had to redeem, and so anyway, so God said, but so one of the reasons I'm doing this is so that every time your animals have a new baby, then when you sacrifice that animal, or you take it to the tabernacle and give it to the Lord, set it apart to the Lord, then it's a reminder to you, and it's also a way for you to testify, so that when your children ask, and I think personally it's not just your children but other people, when they ask, well, why do you do this? And it's because God, He was so merciful and gracious that He spared us. He didn't take away our firstborn when we were in the land of Egypt. So all those reminders are there. We also, like I said, there's many more examples. Some of the things I thought about this week, like the rainbow, reminds us that God's never going to flood the world again. And then another thing, like the 12 stones, when the Israelites crossed the Jordan River, they took the 12 stones, set up a monument to serve as a reminder. And of course, we could keep going with other things, but so plenty of things. And we also looked at some of the things we do today. And again, we didn't look at every detail, but one thing was like the Lord's Supper. We take the Lord's Supper and it's just one of the purposes. There's other reasons for doing it, but one of them is that When we eat the cracker, it's to remind us that, Jesus sacrificed his body in our body's place and took our place. And when we drink the grape juice, it reminds us that Jesus shed his blood for us, and he took our punishment on the cross, so we didn't have to. And so those things remind us. And if we're not careful, we might forget those things. And if we don't rehearse them in our mind, we don't continually thank God for them, then they might lose some of their significance. But when we remember them, and we remember the great sacrifice that God made when he sacrificed Jesus, sent Jesus to die for us, then we need to remember the significance of that and not let the importance of that slip away from us. So anyway, that's where we're at last week. Today we're going to continue. We're going to see another prayer today from Moses and Aaron. So we're going to be in Numbers chapter 20 is where we're going to be at. We'll probably read we'll go to a couple of passages today. But we're going to be in Numbers chapter 20 is where we're going to start at. Let's see, verse 1. So Numbers 20, verse 1. So it says, Then came the children of Israel, even the whole congregation, into the desert of Zin in the first month, and the people abode in Kadesh. So here, the children of Israel, they're still wandering. And most of the stuff I've read about this and studied about it is, so basically from the end of chapter 19 to the first verse in chapter 20, 38 years have passed by. So, everything we've talked about up until this point has been kind of in the beginning when the children of Israel started wandering in the wilderness, and, early on in their journey. But now we are towards the end of their journey, and I'm sure they faced many challenges, in that 38 years. They probably had many issues. They had lots of things that happened because just, the short time that we see of their wandering, we saw a lot of stuff. We covered a lot of stuff, and we'll see even now from the last couple of years here that we're going to look at a couple of things in these events in this time period, after they've wandered for 40 years, and you'll see several other issues that they faced, but evidently the Lord didn't want us to know about all those 38 years. So, but we know they probably faced a lot of challenges and dealt with a lot of things, but we're going to come to see that not much has changed from the time they, and we're going to see that today because we're going to be talking about the waters at Meribah. If you remember, they've been at Meribah before, and that's in Exodus chapter 17. We'll go there in a little bit, time permitting. We don't get to it today. We'll get to it next week. But anyway, so a lot of times passed, but we're going to see that the children of Israel are still doing some of the same things, and and Moses and Aaron are still having to pray for them and ask God to help them. So let's see. The rest of verse 20 says, And Miriam died there and was buried there. So here we see Miriam is Aaron's sister, and here she dies in the wilderness when they're wandering. And you may question, say, well, I thought she was part of Moses' family. She was, one of God's, God has appointed her, and she had a ministry, and she served the Lord. So why did she die in the wilderness? But if you remember, let's jump back to Numbers chapter 12 real quick, and we'll see one of the reasons why she never made it to the land of Canaan. So verse 12, or chapter 12, verse 1 says, Numbers chapter 12, it says, And Miriam and Aaron spake against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married, for he had married an Ethiopian woman. So, if you remember, and we talked about this, we studied Numbers chapter 12 a while back, but we see that Miriam and Aaron both challenged Moses, and it's because of their disobedience in this instance that, I'm sure the Lord said, for this reason, you're not going to enter the land of Canaan, because, you chose to go against me and go against Moses in this instance. And surprised, Moses prayed for her and asked God to spare her back in chapter 12. Remember, she got leprosy. God gave her leprosy, and Aaron begged Moses to pray for her. Moses prayed for her, and God healed her, and she had to be leprous for, I think it was 7 days, and then after the 7 days she was able to come back into the camp, but she still had to suffer. She had consequences then that she had to deal with, and now she has consequences, kind of, I guess, more permanent consequences here. Is she never got to enter the land of Canaan because of her disobedience, and we're going to see the same thing at the end of this chapter. Aaron passes away, and then we also see why Moses was not allowed to enter the land of Canaan. He gets to go and see the land of Canaan, but not actually enter it. So I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. So let's go back to Numbers chapter 20. Numbers chapter 20 verse 2 is where we're at. So Miriam's died. The children of Israel wandering. Miriam has died. Verse 2 says, "And there was no water for the congregation, and they gathered themselves against Moses and against Aaron." So again, we have, and it's the same thing we saw 38 years before. We saw it at Marah. We saw it at Meribah before, and they run out of water. And who do they come to? Who do they challenge? Who do they murmur against? They're murmuring against Moses and Aaron. And really, they're murmuring against God is what they're doing. And we've talked about that several times. Nothing's changed. They're still murmuring against God because God sent them there, and they're looking at it like, well, God sent us here and there's no water. But maybe one reason He did it is so that we can see that that they didn't change a whole lot from when they left Egypt to now. They've been wandering for 38 years. They hadn't learned their lesson just yet. But anyway, so they run out of water, and they challenge Moses and Aaron. They murmur against him. And let's see, verse 3 says, "And the people chode with Moses and spake, saying, Would God that we had died when our brethren died before the Lord." So, they're it's the same thing we just talked about. They're saying, and that's here we see, remember we talked about they're really challenging God, because here we see, would God that we had died. They're saying, well, God's brought us here, now we're going to thirst to death, and that's not good. So, and it's the same thing. Remember we studied before that, this generation's parents, they kept saying, well, we're going to die in the wilderness. God brought us out of Egypt to die in the wilderness. We're going to die in the wilderness. We're going to die in the wilderness. These people, and I think that their parents' mentality and attitude has influenced them, and they're still doing some of the same things. And so they still haven't learned their lesson all the way, I don't think. So, but we'll see in just a second what happens. So, verse 4 says, "And why have ye brought up the congregation of the Lord into this wilderness, that we and our cattle should die there?" So again, they say they're going to die in the wilderness. Their animals are going to die. This is the same thing we saw before, and they still haven't fully learned to trust in the Lord and just rely on Him for the things that they need. And you think, you say, well, maybe that they haven't seen the Lord working in their lives, or they haven't seen anything, but God's still giving them manna up to this point. God fed them manna every day in the wilderness, so that they had been, I guess, reaping the benefits of being God's people for 38 years. I think every day they woke up, except for Sunday, they had manna to go out and gather. And of course, on the sixth day, they had they could go out and gather double, and it kept overnight, and they had enough to eat on the Sabbath day, and that's what they did. And God's been doing that. He's been faithful. I'm sure He never missed a day, and they still haven't fully learned to trust in Him. So let's see, verse 5 says, "And wherefore have ye made us to come up out of Egypt, to bring us in unto this evil place?" So you see, And again, this is something else we've talked about several times. They're referring back to Egypt. They're basically saying we'd rather go back to Egypt. If you remember all the things that happened to them in Egypt, the Pharaoh, they were beating them. They were they were enslaved. They were being mistreated. Their children were being thrown into the river. Their babies being thrown into the river, and Pharaoh was doing everything he could to oppress them and try to keep them from growing. But God continued to bless them, and he brought them into the wilderness, which he could lead them, and they could do what he wanted them to do. But I guess what I'm getting at, Egypt was the evil place, not the wilderness. Of course, the wilderness wasn't the land that flowed with milk and honey that God wanted to give them. They refused to listen to him, so now they're having to wander into this. So maybe mentally they're thinking, well, compared to the land that flowed with milk and honey, this is an evil place. But it's their own fault that they weren't in the land that flowed with milk and honey at this point. Because they refused to follow God, and instead of God destroying them, they had to wander for 40 years. So, the place, the situation they're in is because of their own actions. It's not because God didn't want to do anything for them, and that's what they almost make it sound in verse 4 that God just wanted He didn't want us to die in Egypt, so He brought us out here in the wilderness so we would just die here. But that's not what God wanted. God wanted them all to come out of Egypt, go to the land of Canaan, and live victoriously there. But that's not what they refused to do that, and of course there were consequences for that. And here we see. The rest of verse 5 says, "It is no place of seed, or of figs, or of vines, or of pomegranates, neither is there any water to drink." So here we see they refer to some more food, and I'm going to assume these are things that they had when they were in Egypt. If you remember back in, I don't remember which chapter it was, but there was one chapter where they talked about, when we were in Egypt, we had leeks and garlic and other things, fish, and so here they're reflecting on more of the things that they had in Egypt that they thought were a luxury, and they wanted them again, but they didn't have anything like that. And as they're wandering in the wilderness, they can't plant food, and they talk about the food, and that's just like we talked about with the manna. They didn't have to plant food. They didn't even have to. They're talking about seeds. They didn't even have to plant seeds to grow their own food. God just gave them food. He said, "Here's your manna." So even this statement, they're saying we don't have any seed, no figs, no vines, no pomegranates, none of that stuff. But God, you got the manna. God gave you, food to eat, and He's provided that for you. You don't even have to, you don't have to really work for it. Just go and pick it up. If you had to plant your own seed, you would have to plant it, wait for it to grow, water it, fertilize it, take care of it, weed your gardens, and do all that stuff. You don't even have to do any of that. God gave you food and provided for you, and now instead of being content with that, you want you're wanting all these other things that you had before. So, and then the one thing that they're focusing on again is we don't have any water now. So, they're murmuring about the food. They're saying we want all these other foods, and he's saying, now they're saying there's no water to drink. And again, this is not the first time they ran out of water. They ran out of water. I know we've talked about at least 2 instances they ran out of water. Or I guess at Mara the water was bitter and they couldn't drink it, so they didn't have water to drink. They had water, it just wasn't good. But God still, remember God told Moses, you take this tree, you put it in the water and it'll make it sweet. And then at Meribah, and we'll see that. We're going to go and read the story at Meribah in just a little bit. So anyway, they're out of water again, and they still haven't said, well, their attitude should be at this point, we don't have water. we've saw God provide us water before. Let's rely on God, and just we can pray to God and ask God to give us water and see what He does. But instead of doing that, they go and complain and murmur about it and say, go to Moses, and they're chiding with Moses and Aaron and saying, what did God bring us out here to let us die of thirst? And they have the wrong attitude, same as before. But we see Moses and Aaron's actions are the correct actions to take. And let's read verse 6. So verse 6 says, and Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly unto the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. So, I think the congregation came up against Moses and Aaron. They said, okay, we'll go and pray and ask God what He wants us to do. So they go to the tabernacle. And this is what they do at the tabernacle. It says, and they fell upon their faces, and the glory of the Lord appeared unto them. So they go and pray, and we see that God immediately comes down to answer what they're asking for. So the glory of the Lord comes down to talk to them. And now in verse 7, we're going to see what the Lord tells Moses to do. And verse 7 says, and the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, so this is what God tells. This is God's answer to Moses' prayer. So here we see Moses and Aaron pray for what to do about the water, and God comes down to answer them. And this is His answer to that. And one thing I want to talk about, you see they got an immediate answer, an immediate response. Sometimes we don't get that. Sometimes we have to wait a while, like we talked about before. But here, they get, and we see that a good bit with Moses and Aaron when they're praying. They get pretty expedient response, and of course that's I think it's because of their faithfulness and their relationship with the Lord, and how close they were to Him, and how they lived for Him and served Him, and anyway, we see this happen again. So verse 8 says, take the rod, and this is, I think this is still referring to the rod. Remember, Moses had a rod in the on the back side of the desert where he was tending to the sheep. He had that rod. He's carried that rod. It's the same rod that God turned into a stick, or turned into a snake. Sorry, it was already a stick, but God made it a snake and then turned it back into a stick. So I guess He did turn it into a stick at one point, but turned it into a snake or serpent, however you want to say it, and then turned it back into a stick. And it's the rod that Moses used, or that God used. He put it in the hands of Moses and let Moses use it, to part the Red Sea, to do all those things. It's the one he held. I don't know if we've read that. I don't think we've read that. It's the one he holds up when they're fighting the people. When he lets it down, they start getting defeated. But when he lifts it up again, the Israelites win the battle. So, anyway, that's the rod. And again, we see something. This is something that Moses already had. It's something that God had already blessed Moses with, and now God's able to use that from throughout Moses' entire ministry. Here we see it used over and over and over again. So this is so you can see the Lord takes something that we think is insignificant and means nothing, and He's able to use it to do many great things. And it's all through His power. The rod itself has no power, but God is able to use it, and just like people and things we have today. If we turn our possessions over to the Lord and let Him use them the way He wants to, or we turn our lives over to the Lord, He can use our lives to do many great things for Himself. The rest of verse 8 says, and gather thou the assembly together, thou and Aaron thy brother. So he says, you and Aaron go, take your rod, you and Aaron go, and gather the congregation together. And this is what I want you to do. And it says, and speak ye unto the rock before their eyes, and it shall give forth his water, and thou shalt bring forth them water out of the rock. So here we see, and this is important, and we'll see in a minute what he did the last time he was here, but he says, speak ye unto the rock. He didn't say a rock, he says the rock. And we're going to see the rock. It's the same rock that they used before, that God sent them water from before. But this time God says, just speak unto the rock, and it will bring forth water. That's what God tells him to do. So God tells Moses to go. Moses and Aaron, get the whole congregation together. Bring them to this rock. You're going to speak to the rock, and water's going to come out of it. So again, remember me telling you, it took a lot of faith. You think about today, if you were leading a group of people, say on a journey through the wilderness, let's picture us walking through, me and a group of, hundreds of thousands of people walking, and there is no water. They're all complaining, and God said, "Well, you go there and tell that rock to give you water, and it'll give you water." You think of the faith that takes to do that, because these people before, and I don't remember if it was at Meribah, if it was at Marah, but Moses thought the people were going to kill him then, because he said these people are ready to stone me, and what's he going to think now? I'm going to go up here, I'm going to stand in front of these people, and I'm going to start telling this rock to give them water. They're going to think I've lost my mind. They're going to drag me out and stone me outside the camp. Of course, we know that's not what happens, but I just put myself in this situation and try to think, what would I do, or some of the things that would happen, and that's kind of one of the things I thought about. So, just seeing the faith of Moses and Aaron and the things they do, and you can see by their actions they're trusting in God, and they're bringing these people to do that. Of course, and this is where Moses gets a little bit. He doesn't do exactly what the Lord tells him in this case, but anyway, I was just thinking about those things. And let's see, the rest of verse 8 says, "So thou shalt give the congregation and their beasts drink." So, water is going to come out of the rock, and the people are going to be able to drink, and their animals, and there's going to be sufficient water to satisfy the thirst of all these people, all their animals, and everything will be good now. And that's another thing, I thought about this. The amount of water it would take to, for these, not just the people to drink, but you think of all the animals to drink. It's going to take a significant amount of water, and so verse 9 says, "And Moses took the rod from before the Lord as he had commanded him." So Moses takes his rod, and he's ready to go to the rock and do what God's told him to do. Verse 10 says, and Moses lifted up his, that's verse 11. Verse 10, it says, "And Moses and Aaron gathered the congregation before the rock, and he said unto them, Hear now, ye rebels, must we fetch you water out of this rock?" So there are several important things here in this verse. Is one, he calls the people rebels because, and you say, well, are they really rebels because they're just asking for some water, but they're not trusting in God. They're murmuring against God, and they're saying, and remember, we always think of Korah. Remember Korah, we call that the rebellion of Korah. So we see that Moses is kind of referring to the people now as rebels, just like Korah and his people, because of their refusal to trust in God, refusal to follow God, and just let him provide and meet their need. They challenge him and come against him over and over again instead of just trusting in him. Another thing that's going to be important, we'll probably reread this verse when we get to it, but is Moses said, "Must we fetch you water out of this rock?" So one important thing here is in the terms of Moses, Aaron, and God, there is no we. God is the one sending the water. So we're going to talk about kind of Moses' approach to this case in just a minute, but that's important when he says we. So, and we'll refer back to it in just a second. But verse 11 says, "And Moses lifted up his hand, and with his rod he smote the rock twice." So is that what God told him to do? Let's look back at verse 8 real quick, and let's see exactly what God told him to do. Verse 8 says, "Take the rod, and gather thou the assembly together, thou and Aaron thy brother, and speak ye unto the rock." So he says, "Speak ye unto the rock before their eyes." He doesn't tell him to smite the rock, and that's what Moses did here in verse 11. He smote the rock twice. So he hit the rock twice instead of speaking to it. So we see that he didn't do exactly what God had told him to do, but we're going to look at the results of that and see there's consequences. The Lord's still faithful and provides water, which is what we see here in the rest of verse 11. It says, "And the water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their beast also." So that's like what I was saying before. It says the water came out abundantly. Remember, we said it was going to take a whole heap of water to feed or to for all these people and all these animals to drink, but the water just came gushing out of the rock, and and it was more than enough for these people to drink, to satisfy their thirst, to satisfy their beast thirst. So all of that was, plenty of water for them to drink. So that's what. So we see that, Moses didn't exactly follow what God said, and again, I don't know exactly why. I don't know. Maybe if he was getting a little bit, maybe his sister just died, and maybe he was dealing with all those things too, and the people challenging him. So maybe he's just getting tired of dealing with them, and maybe he just made him. All these things are going on. Maybe he knows that God is calling him. Maybe he's getting a little bit arrogant. I don't really know why, but he made a mistake. He didn't do exactly what God said he was going to do, and I don't think it was he did it ignorantly. I think it's something that he intentionally did, and that's why we're going to see in just a second that there are consequences to that. You say, well, God still sent the water. Well, God promised to send the water and to take care of the Israelites, and he held up his end of the bargain, even though Moses didn't do it exactly like he's supposed to. But now in verse 12, we're going to see that Moses still has to suffer consequences for it. God, he wanted his people to have water. Moses had prayed and asked God to give them water, and God said, "I'm going to give them water," and so he fulfills his promise. But Moses didn't do exactly what he was supposed to. So now in verse 12 we're going to see what the results of that is. So it says, "And the Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron, because ye believe me not, to sanctify me in the eyes of Israel." So that's one thing I think that back in verse 10 where it says we, God's saying you should have told him that I was going to send you forth water, and it was all me. You're trying to take away some of my glory, and you're not completely believing me. You're thinking maybe you're doing some of these things in your own might, your own power, but I'm providing all this, not you. It says, so here we see what the consequence is of that. It says, "Therefore ye shall not bring this congregation into the land which I have given them." So here he's saying, since you didn't do exactly what I told you to do, you didn't do it exactly the way I told you to do it, I still gave them water because that's what I said I was going to do. But now, your disobedience, the consequences of that is you're not going to enter the land of Canaan. Before, my will was for you to take these people in. You bring them into the land of Canaan. Maybe I'll give you a river house on the Jordan River. You can retire and just reap the benefits of that I prepared for you there. But now you haven't done that, so now you're not going to make it into the land of Canaan. You're going to die outside, and we'll see later that Moses gets to see the land of Canaan, but he doesn't get to lead the people in. Of course, Joshua, he hands the reins over to Joshua, and Joshua is the one who the Lord let's lead the people into the land of Canaan. But I think that had Moses been faithful and did what God told him to do here, then he would have been able to lead the Israelites into the land of Canaan, and he would have reaped the benefits of that. But since he didn't, now we see that he's not going to get to enter the land of Canaan. So verse 13 says, "This is the water of Meribah, because the children of Israel strove with the Lord, and he was sanctified in them." So there we see, God provided them water as He said, and made them realize it was from Him. So I guess we'll stop there for today. We'll go back next week and we'll compare this to the stuff in Exodus chapter 17. But we're not gonna have time to do it this morning. We're gonna run out of time if we don't. If we try to do all that, or we'll not get it, not go through it all in enough detail to understand all of it. So we're going to stop there for today, and we'll pick up again next week and continue on. So I appreciate y'all coming and joining us this morning. But we see again another prayer for Moses and Aaron, and we see, the children of Israel, they've wandered for 38 years. They've they're coming to the end of their wandering in the wilderness, but they still haven't completely learned their lesson. They're still making some of the same mistakes that they made before. And here we see Moses and Aaron still having to intercede for them and pray for them, and that's what they have to do. And God provides them water. They run out of water here. Moses and Aaron pray, and God gives them water. But another thing we see is that's very important is, we see God answer Moses' prayer, but Moses doesn't do exactly what God tells him to do, and God still fulfills his end of the deal, or end of the, God provides water like He promised to do. So He still answers the prayer, but since Moses didn't do exactly, and this kind of ties in our lesson, because we're looking at how we should react when God answers our prayer and tells us to do a specific thing, but through that prayer we need to do it exactly like God tells us to do it, or there are going to be consequences for it. Just like what we see here with Moses. He didn't speak to the rock, he hit it twice, and now his consequences are that he's not going to enter the land of Canaan, and he's not going to reap all the benefits that the Lord's prepared for him and set up for him to have when he got there. So we have to be very careful what we do and make sure we're following God and doing exactly what. And of course, if Moses had done it ignorantly, then I don't think the consequences would have been as severe. But I think Moses, I don't know for what reason, but he purposely hit the rock instead of speaking to it. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that next week, because we'll see. Before, when he was there, he hit the rock. God told him to smite the rock, so he hit the rock once and water came out. So maybe he's saying, this is what I did before. God's telling me to do this now. This is what I did before. I'm going to do it this way because that's what worked before. But he should have listened to God and did exactly what God told him to do. So anyway, that's kind of a quick synopsis of what we talked about today. Again, thank you all for joining us this morning. I'm going to close us in a word of prayer. Before I do that, I'd like to, anybody that's here can come and join us for our physical church service. We'd love to have you, and love to have you come. We have Sunday school at 10. We have church at 11. Church again at 6 on tonight, and then church at 7 on Wednesday night. So anybody that's able in the area and able to come and join us, we'd love to have you. If not, hopefully you'll be able to join us again next week. And I'm going to close us in a word of prayer, and then we'll cut off the lesson for this week. So Lord, we come to you this morning. We just thank you for giving us your word, giving us examples so we can study and just apply it to our lives, Lord, and just grow and just draw nigh unto you, Lord. We just pray that you be with us now. Pray that you lead, guide, and direct us, Lord. Pray that you be with the church service this morning. Pray that you be with all the ones that are sick and the ones that won't be able to join us today, Lord. Thank you for all your many blessings. In Jesus' holy name we pray. Amen.